We'll read 1 Peter chapter 2 and verses 18 to 20 today. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it if, when ye be buffeted for your faults, ye shall take it patiently? But if, when you do well and suffer for it, ye take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. I think it was the late David Gooding who told a story about two brothers playing together. The older boy was goading the younger brother to such an extent that the younger finally flipped and hit his older sibling. It was just at that point that mother entered the room. Ignorant of the provocation that had led up to the strike, she clipped the younger son on the ear, that's what was done in those days, and sent him to his room. As he left the scene in tears, the younger boy screamed, "It's just not fair." These verses are very challenging to me because I have to ask myself the question, how do I react when it's not fair? It's relatively easy to keep ourselves together when things are going well. Peter writes about being subject to your masters with all fear in verse 18, and immediately goes on to mention masters who are good and gentle. By and large, I have had good bosses and they have treated me well, but not every Christian has that blessing. There are bosses who are froward, as Peter describes them here. Froward simply means crooked. People who are carnaptious, I think that's a great word, or who have a warped kind of behaviour. They are difficult to get on with. In employment nowadays, there are all kinds of grievance procedures, and there are channels through which people are able to take their employers to task, to lodge claims against them, or to sue for unfair treatment. We're encouraged to assert our rights nowadays and not let people walk all over us. But is that what Christians ought to do? In these verses, Peter writes about suffering wrongfully, verse 19, and about suffering patiently whenever you do well or what is right. Is he only writing this because the lack of employment law in the Roman Empire meant that they had no other option? I really don't think so. There is something much more important that Peter has in view. He is concerned that we live our lives for the glory of God. And that is why he mentions about a man for conscience toward God enduring grief. And that's why he points him towards acting in a way that is acceptable with God, verse 20. The words thankworthy in verse 19 and acceptable in verse 20 are in fact the same word, and it simply means grace or graciousness. Peter is reminding us that in every circumstance, even in difficult circumstances, a believer should always act in grace or with grace. And what a challenge I find that personally to me. In verse 10 of chapter 1, Peter wrote about the grace that should, in other words, that has come unto you. And then in verse 13 he writes about the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. These verses show the grace that we should exhibit here and now in our everyday lives. It is this submissive spirit, in contrast to the assertive spirit of the world, that Peter advocates to his Christian readers. And he will tell us why this is so important in the following verses that we'll look at next.